The first trucks arrived before sunrise. A cold mist covered the fields outside a temporary prisoner camp near Regensburg, Germany. It was early May 1945. The war in Europe was over. German weapons had fallen silent. Across the continent, church bells rang, families celebrated, and exhausted soldiers believed the nightmare had finally ended. But inside this camp, no one celebrated.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
Nearly 5,000 Soviet prisoners stood behind rows of barbed wire, staring toward the road. Every engine sound made their hearts race. They believed American soldiers had come to take them to freedom. They had survived years of hunger, forced labor, disease, and German prison camps. Now they waited for the gates to open. Instead, a different order was moving across Europe. Hundreds of miles away, inside the Kremlin in Moscow, Joseph Stalin had already made up his mind. In his eyes, these men were not heroes returning home. They were suspects. Soviet policy was simple and terrifying. Any Red Army soldier captured alive by the enemy had failed the Soviet Union. Many would face investigation. Some would disappear into labor camps. Others would never see their families again. For thousands of prisoners, the end of World War II did not mean freedom. It meant another journey into fear. At almost the same moment, another commander was reading reports in southern Germany. General George S. Patton, commander of the United States Third Army, had spent months driving across Europe with unmatched speed. His tanks had crossed France, smashed through German defenses, relieved Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and helped break the Nazi war machine. Patton had seen destruction everywhere. But the reports now arriving on his desk described a different kind of tragedy. Thousands of Soviet prisoners did not want to go home. That single sentence refused to leave his mind. You can almost feel the silence inside headquarters as officers placed more documents on Patton's desk. Every report carried nearly the same message. Soviet prisoners begged American guards not to hand them over. Some claimed they would rather stay behind barbed wire than return to the Soviet Union. Others whispered stories of secret police, prison trains, and executions waiting across the border. At first, some American officers struggled to believe them. The war had been fought to defeat Nazi Germany. Surely the Soviet Union, one of the victorious allies, would welcome its own soldiers home. The truth was far more complicated. To understand why this crisis exploded in May 1945, you have to go back almost 4 years earlier. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. More than 3 million German troops crossed into the Soviet Union. Entire Soviet armies collapsed during the first months of fighting. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers became prisoners in massive encirclements around Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, and Vyazma. By the end of 1941, millions of Soviet soldiers had been captured. The conditions inside German prison camps were beyond brutal. Food was almost non-existent. Disease spread rapidly. Winter temperatures killed thousands. Many prisoners were forced into labor on farms, factories, railroads, and construction projects across occupied Europe. Others simply died where they stood. Historians estimate that millions of Soviet prisoners never survived German captivity. Those who did survive carried invisible scars. Some escaped and joined resistance groups. Some were liberated by advancing Allied armies during the final months of the war. Others wandered through broken Germany, searching for food and safety. They had one hope. They believed surviving the war meant they had earned the right to return home with honor. They did not yet understand the view from Moscow. Long before Germany surrendered, Stalin had already made his position clear. Soviet Order Number 270, issued in August 1941, declared that commanders and soldiers who surrendered could be treated as traitors. The order came during the darkest days of the German invasion, when entire Soviet armies were collapsing. Stalin believed surrender weakened national resistance. His message was harsh. Soviet soldiers were expected to fight until death if necessary. Years later, that policy still cast a dark shadow. Inside the Kremlin, victory over Germany was becoming reality. Soviet flags already flew over Berlin. Millions celebrated the destruction of Hitler's regime. Yet Stalin remained deeply suspicious. He believed years spent in enemy captivity could expose Soviet soldiers to foreign influence, anti-Soviet ideas, or possible recruitment by German intelligence. Whether those fears were justified or not mattered little. The policy remained unchanged. Meanwhile, across Germany, American troops continued discovering camps filled with prisoners from every corner of Europe. Some were French. Others were Dutch, Belgian, Polish, Yugoslav, British, American, or Soviet. Medical officers treated starvation. Engineers repaired roads. Supply units distributed food. The scale of human suffering shocked even experienced combat veterans. Patton visited several liberated areas himself. He had seen concentration camps. He had seen civilians searching through ruins for missing relatives. Every mile across Germany revealed another reminder of what 6 years of war had done to Europe. Yet the growing problem involving Soviet prisoners was different from anything his staff expected. The issue was not rescue. It was what happened after rescue. Earlier that year, in February 1945, leaders of the Allied powers met at the Yalta Conference on the Crimean Peninsula. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin discussed the future of Europe while the war still raged. Among countless agreements was one concerning the return of displaced citizens after Germany's defeat. In principle, Allied governments agreed to repatriate liberated nationals to their home countries. On paper, the agreement looked simple. Reality would prove anything but simple. As American forces pushed deeper into Bavaria and Western Austria during April and May 1945, thousands of Soviet citizens entered areas controlled by the United States Third Army. Some had worn Red Army uniforms. Others had been forced into labor inside Germany. There were also civilians who had fled advancing Soviet forces for their own reasons. Every day the numbers increased. The responsibility landed on American commanders. Patton demanded accurate information. Who were these people? Were they genuine prisoners? Were they collaborators? Were they refugees? His intelligence officers worked around the clock trying to separate facts from rumor. The answers rarely came easily. Europe in 1945 was filled with false identities, missing records, destroyed documents, and people desperate to survive. Then came something impossible to ignore. Interpreters began reporting emotional conversations with Soviet prisoners. Again and again, the prisoners repeated nearly identical warnings. If they returned home, they believed they would be arrested. Some openly described Soviet labor camps. Others quietly admitted they had heard of entire families punished because a relative had been captured by the Germans. Many had no idea whether their wives, children, or parents were still alive. American guards watched grown men break into tears after hearing they might be sent east. Some officers wondered whether fear itself had distorted their thinking after years of captivity. Others believed every word. Patton listened carefully. He had never hidden his opinions about the Soviet leadership. Although the United States and the Soviet Union had fought together against Germany, Patton privately distrusted Stalin's government. He admired military strength but viewed communist rule with deep suspicion. His personal diary reflected growing concern about Soviet intentions in post-war Europe. As American and Soviet forces met along the Elbe River in April 1945, cooperation existed on the surface, yet distrust quietly expanded underneath. Every new report strengthened Patton's doubts. Across occupied Germany, Soviet liaison officers also became increasingly active. Their mission was clear: locate Soviet citizens, organize transportation, return them east as quickly as possible. Officially, these were routine repatriation operations between allies. Unofficially, everyone involved understood emotions were running dangerously high. Inside several camps, rumors spread faster than official announcements. Prisoners whispered that Soviet officers had already arrived nearby. Some hid inside barns. Others blended into groups of different nationalities. A few even attempted escape, despite having nowhere safe to go. Imagine surviving years inside German captivity only to fear the soldiers wearing your own country's uniform. That fear puzzled many American soldiers. For them, home meant family, peace, and relief from war. Watching liberated prisoners desperately avoid returning home challenged everything they believed victory was supposed to mean. Patton wanted more answers before making decisions. He ordered additional interviews. Intelligence officers compared testimonies from different camps. Military police checked identities whenever possible. Chaplains spoke with frightened prisoners. Doctors observed the severe physical condition of many survivors. Piece by piece, a disturbing picture emerged. Whether every story was true hardly mattered anymore. The fear itself was undeniably real. Back in Moscow, Stalin showed no signs of changing course. Victory celebrations filled Red Square. Newspapers praised the heroism of the Soviet people. Military parades were already being planned. But behind closed doors, Soviet security organizations prepared for another enormous operation. Millions of returning citizens would pass through screening centers. Investigators would decide who could safely return to civilian life and who required further questioning. For many former prisoners of war, that process became another ordeal after surviving Nazi captivity. The distance between Moscow and Patton's headquarters measured more than 1,000 miles. The distance between their beliefs was even greater. One leader saw national security through absolute control. The other increasingly saw human beings trapped between political promises and personal survival. Neither man intended to surrender his position. Neither fully trusted the other. And caught between them stood thousands of exhausted prisoners whose future depended on decisions made far above their heads. Within days, pressure on Patton's headquarters would become overwhelming. Official requests from Soviet representatives were becoming firmer. Washington expected Allied agreements to be honored. Military lawyers reviewed existing commitments. Staff officers debated obligations versus conscience late into the night. Every possible choice carried consequences. Patton understood that whatever happened next would not simply affect 5,000 prisoners. It could test the fragile alliance that had just won the greatest war in history. And the hardest decision had not even arrived yet. The pressure reached its highest point during the second half of May 1945. Messages moved constantly between American headquarters, Allied command, and Soviet liaison officers. The fighting was over, but another battle had begun. This one was fought with orders, agreements, and political promises instead of tanks and artillery. Every commander understood that the alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union had defeated Nazi Germany together. None wanted that alliance to collapse only days after victory. General George S. Patton, however, could not ignore what he was seeing with his own eyes. More reports arrived from camps across Bavaria and Austria. American officers described Soviet prisoners begging not to be handed over. Some offered to work in Germany. Others asked to be sent to Britain, Canada, or the United States. Many simply asked for time. They believed that if someone in Washington learned the truth, the decision might change. For Patton, the situation became deeply personal. He had spent his career believing that courage deserved respect. These men had already survived one of the harshest experiences imaginable. Many had endured years of starvation, forced labor, disease, and constant fear under German control. Now they faced another terrifying future, not because they had committed a crime, but because they had fallen into enemy hands during one of history's largest wars. Still, Patton was also a soldier. He understood that armies function through discipline and lawful orders. The United States had made commitments to its allies. Ignoring those commitments could create a diplomatic crisis at the very moment Europe needed stability. Every path forward seemed wrong. As intelligence officers continued their interviews, another disturbing pattern appeared. Many prisoners gave remarkably similar accounts without knowing each other. They spoke of Soviet screening camps run by the NKVD. They feared accusations of treason. They worried that their families had already been punished because they had been captured. Some had heard stories from escaped prisoners who claimed entire trainloads of returning soldiers disappeared into labor camps after crossing the Soviet border. American investigators could not independently verify every story, but they no longer questioned the fear. One officer later remembered that many prisoners became silent whenever repatriation was mentioned. Others cried openly. Some fell to their knees. They were not reacting like men returning home after victory. They behaved like men standing at the edge of another prison. Patton privately expressed growing frustration. His diary entries from the period reveal increasing distrust of Soviet intentions and criticism of Allied policy toward the Soviet Union. He believed the Western Allies were making dangerous concessions. Although he remained under orders, his personal opinions became impossible to hide from members of his staff. Rumors soon spread through headquarters that Patton wanted greater flexibility in handling at least some groups of Soviet prisoners. Those rumors have fueled dramatic stories for decades. Some later accounts claimed Patton openly refused Stalin's demands regarding thousands of prisoners. Others claimed he secretly delayed transfers or searched for legal ways to protect certain individuals. The historical record, however, is far more complicated than many headlines suggest. The truth is both dramatic and tragic. The Western Allies, including American forces, generally carried out repatriation agreements that had been approved at the highest political level. In many areas under American and British control, Soviet citizens were transferred to Soviet authorities. Some returned peacefully. Others resisted desperately. Historians continue to debate individual cases, local decisions, and exactly how different commanders responded under changing circumstances. Patton's sympathy for many anti-Soviet refugees became increasingly clear. His criticism of Soviet policy also became more outspoken as the months passed. That attitude placed him at odds with the political reality shaping post-war Europe. Imagine standing beside one of those trains. The war has finally ended. The shooting has stopped. The smoke has begun to clear. Yet instead of traveling toward freedom, thousands of exhausted survivors are climbing into rail cars with fear written across every face. American guards watch silently. Soviet officers wait at the other end of the journey. Nobody knows exactly what will happen after the border disappears behind them. For many families, that uncertainty lasted for years. Soviet authorities established filtration camps to screen returning prisoners of war and civilians. Some individuals eventually returned to normal civilian life. Others were assigned to labor battalions. Some were imprisoned after investigation. The outcome depended on many factors, including military records, occupation history, and Soviet security evaluations. The experience was harsh, and for countless people it added another painful chapter after surviving German captivity. Patton never became comfortable with what he believed was happening across Eastern Europe. As 1945 turned into the early months of peace, disagreements between former allies became more visible. The friendship built during the war quickly gave way to suspicion. Borders hardened. Political influence spread across Eastern Europe. The world was quietly entering what would soon become known as the Cold War. Patton saw many of those changes before most people did. He warned that Soviet expansion deserved serious attention. His blunt opinions made some political leaders uncomfortable. While many hoped cooperation with Moscow would continue, Patton believed future conflict was becoming increasingly likely. His outspoken nature also created problems inside the American military. He had already attracted controversy earlier in the war through several incidents and public remarks. After Germany's surrender, his criticism of Allied occupation policies and his comments regarding the Soviet Union brought even greater attention. In October 1945, he was removed from command of the Third Army and reassigned to the 15th Army, a largely administrative position focused on compiling the history of the European campaign. For a commander famous for leading armored breakthroughs across France and Germany, it was a dramatic change. Only weeks later, on December 9, 1945, Patton was seriously injured in an automobile accident near Mannheim, Germany. 12 days later, on December 21, he died in a military hospital at Heidelberg. He was 60 years old. His death ended one of the most remarkable military careers of the Second World War. But debates about his final months never disappeared. Over the decades, books, documentaries, and articles have often presented dramatic versions of the story involving thousands of Soviet prisoners and Stalin's demands. Some versions claim Patton directly defied orders to protect exactly 5,000 prisoners. The surviving historical evidence does not support such a simple conclusion. What it does show is that Patton strongly distrusted Stalin, questioned Soviet intentions, sympathized with many displaced people under his authority, and became increasingly vocal about the direction of post-war Europe. Sometimes the real story is more powerful than the legend. This was never a tale about one general defeating another after the war had ended. It was about thousands of ordinary people trapped between two victorious powers. They had already survived Hitler's camps. Now they faced decisions made in distant government offices where strategy mattered more than individual lives. The tragedy reminds us that the end of fighting does not always mean the end of suffering. Peace treaties can save nations while still leaving countless individuals caught between promises, politics, and fear. The victory celebrations of May 1945 were real. So were the tears inside prisoner camps where many people realized that liberation did not guarantee freedom. You can almost picture those quiet roads across southern Germany as military trucks disappeared into the distance. The crowds were gone. The cheering had faded. The guns were silent. Yet history continued to move forward, carrying with it thousands of stories that rarely appeared in headlines. For General George S. Patton, the war ended with difficult questions that had no easy answers. For many Soviet prisoners, the war ended with another uncertain journey. And for the world, those difficult days marked the beginning of a new struggle. One no longer fought mainly with bullets and tanks, but with ideology, suspicion, and political power. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was already breaking apart. Behind the celebrations of victory, the first shadows of the Cold War had begun to fall, proving that history's most dangerous battles do not always begin with the sound of gunfire. Sometimes they begin with a single order, a silent train, and thousands of people wondering whether freedom will ever truly be theirs.